afternoon again, and welcome to the last session of our conference. Now, as I said, we'll deal with economic matters. As I told you, our project was interdisciplinary, it was multidisciplinary in nature. We were convinced, and we are convinced, that only through the combination of many approaches is possible to deal with this complex topic. So we think that the economic dimension is a vital one to understand what occurred in that crucial period between the mid-80s and the mid-90s. The first speaker is Antonio Magliulo. Antonio Magliulo is a full professor of history of the economic thought at the University of Florence. Is an expert of the role of economic ideas in the process of formation of Europe, and in this sense is an important, it can give an important contribution to the conference, and also the Italian economic thought and politics. He is here to present a paper whose title is A Common European Home, the Historical Significance of a Failed Attempt. I invite him to come here and to present his slides. Thank you, Antonio.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and many thanks to the organizer for giving me the opportunity to take part in this interesting conference. As you can see, I'm also going to talk about the common European home, and maybe it's so. In March 1985, Gorbachev was appointed the General Secretary for the Communist Party, and from then to 1991, in several ways, he launched the proposal of a common European home. And in the literature, we can find several studies trying to propose an explanation of the failure of this proposal. So scholars have emphasized several factors: the responsibility of Bush America, Kohl's Germany, Mitterrand's France, as well as the weakness of the Gorbachev's proposal. Maybe they had underestimated, as well as Gorbachev has mentioned this morning, the role of the European community. So the aim of my work is to try to grasp the historical significance of the failed project by reconstructing the response given by the European Commission, chaired by Jacques Delors, to the Soviet Union's proposal. Of course, during these 6 years, there were an evolution, both in the proposal and in the European response. And I identified 3 main stages in this short history. First, the first 2 years, the early Soviet proposal and the West, European skepticism. Secondly, a real turning point occurred in 1987 and the updated proposal. And finally, I took the liberty to use another image, but we could say that something changed in the last 2 years when the idea of Delors, Europe is a village rather than a big home, prevailed. So let me start with the first point. Well, we must remind that Jacques Delors was appointed president of the European Commission in January 1985. At that time, basically, Europe was composed by 12 countries. Portugal and Spain joined in 1986. Europe basically means common market, an incomplete and imperfect common market started with the Rome treaties. The European monetary system, introduced in March 1979, so a new regime of quasi-fixed exchange rates, and the election of the parliament. This was Europe around 1985. And immediately, Delors launched the program of the single act, meaning to complete by 1992, a single market, meaning recognizing the four freedoms, the free circulation of goods, services, people, and capital. This was his main aim at the beginning of his mandate. In parallel, Gorbachev, he immediately realized that the Soviet Union needed a radical reform. Perestroika was coined 2 years later, but immediately realized the need for a radical reform, requiring a foreign policy of cooperation and detente, so as to shift public resources from armaments to investments. It seems to me that this was the priority of Gorbachev, to have resources for investment, reducing the amount of money devoted to army. And in October, he made his first official visit abroad in France, repeating, because the sentence was used 1 year before of the British Parliament. Europe is our common home. But it was an unclear proposal. What does it mean? What did Gorbachev want? Enter the common market? Not at all. Join the European monetary system? Not at all. Or EFTA? Or dissolve the military bloc? I don't think so. It was just an attempt to change foreign policy, to trigger a wave of cooperation. And during the first 2 years of his government, Gorbachev addressed the leaders of the big Western countries, Mitterrand, Thatcher, Reagan, but ignored Delors' Europe. The proposal raised silence from Delors and skepticism from other Western leaders. I'm talking about the early proposal at the beginning. In short, at the beginning, the Soviet proposal to build a common home was a little more than a vague foreign policy tool, greeted with silence and skepticism by the West. A real turning point occurred in the following 2 years, from spring 1987 to summer 1989. On April, Gorbachev delivered a major speech in Prague. On November, his influential book appeared. On July 1989, he delivered another famous speech, this time in Strasbourg, before the Council of Europe on the topic Europe as a common home. In parallel, Delors completed his first mandate and began the second mandate. And above all, he was appointed the president of a special committee, the so-called Delors Committee, and charged to advance a proposal of an economic and monetary union. The proposal was presented in April 1989, so before the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the idea was, in order to have a well-working common market with the four freedoms, Europe needed a stronger monetary union. Delors and Padoa-Schioppa and other economists were well aware that it was no more sufficient to have an European monetary system. They used one word to have an irreversible process of monetary union. It means a single currency. It means a common monetary policy. This was the priority in Delors' view. In this slide, I try to summarize the updated proposal of Gorbachev. Both the Soviet proposal and the European response become clearer. The common home becomes, I took the liberty to use this image, an apartment building in 2 blocks, a condominium rather than a common home, inhabited by Europeans. We all are Europeans. We all are Europeans, Gorbachev argues, because we have known and shared the same values transmitted by Christianity, Renaissance, Enlightenment. The new Europe should have pursued a policy of cooperation among sovereign nation states rather than economic integration, requiring laws of national sovereignty. In Gorbachev's view, the model was cooperation among sovereign nation states, oriented to a twofold aim, security and development. And the real obstacle was not the existence of two blocks, as many politicians believe in West, but the attempt to cancel one bloc in Gorbachev's view. And here I collected some quotation briefly. Gorbachev, we are Europeans. This morning we heard these words. Old Russia was united with Europe by Christianity, and the millennium of its arrival in the land of our ancestor will be marked next year. The Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and so on. Europe, from the Atlantic to the Urals, is a cultural, historical entity, united by the common heritage of the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and so on. Again, cooperation, not integration, cooperation. Our notion of the common European home does not imply at all any intention to shoot the doors on anyone. In the west side of the Europe, Delors was thinking about the criteria to select countries to join the Economic and Monetary Union. Gorbachev had another perspective, confederation rather than federation, confederation rather than federation. The real obstacle was the attempt to cancel the socialist bloc. Delors' response. It is essentially contained in his January 1989 speech before the European Parliament and revolves around the constraint dilemma between deepening to govern the new European Union and widening. In line with the neo-functionalist approach chosen by the Commission, Delors maintained that priority should have been deepening. That is, completing the process of economic integration to arrive at the political union of the community, while enlargement to the East should have taken the form and content of a policy of cooperation among nation states and supranational institutions. And here is the image of a European village, a group of houses with that of European community at the center. He said, internal development, deepening, takes priority over widening, over enlargement. Nothing must distract us from our duty to make a success of the single act. But the community is much more than a large market. It's a frontier-free economic and social area on the way to becoming a political union, entailing closer cooperation on foreign policy and security. This is a key point. Economic integration in Delors and in the previous president of the European Commission is just a way to achieve political union. Moreover, if I were asked to depict that village today, so Europe as a village, I would see in it a house called the European Community. We are its sole architects. We are the keepers of its keys, but we are prepared to open its doors to talk with our neighbors. So seems to me that this is a clear idea of Europe priority. It is to build the European community home with different criteria compared to the Gorbachev proposal. And Bush, okay. So second, in short, between the spring 1987 and summer 1989, a direct dialogue triggered between Gorbachev, Soviet Union, and Delors community, and the alternative between a condominium, because Gorbachev was thinking a two-block, and the village emerged. From last point, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Gorbachev sought to accelerate perestroika and above all to save Soviet Union. And Mitterrand, a few minutes ago, has been reminded has the idea of Mitterrand. Mitterrand and Delors proposed the establishment of a confederation in Europe, in a Europe of concentric circles. Both used this idea. Concentric circles means a differentiated Europe with different level of integration, but with one major difference. Mitterrand, December 1989, in his end-of-year television message, the French president argued that the new Europe should be built in two stages. First, and immediately, strengthening the community of 12. Later on, during the 90s, on the basis of the Helsinki Accords, through a confederation associating all the states of the continent in a common and permanent organization of trade, peace, and security. Delors, a few days after a speech, in a speech again delivered before the European Parliament, just 1 year later, January 1990. Delors specified, my own view, however, is that a grand confederation will not come into being until the community achieves political union. It means that not just the single nation state should take part into the confederation, but first of all, a stronger political European Union. He reiterated this idea that the community should first transform itself into a true federal political union, equipped with a genuine government, and then around it form a broader European confederation. Mitterrand's reaction was angry. He said, it's stupid. It's stupid. Reopening the old and still unresolved dilemma between deepening and widening. 1990 was a good year. Some scholars said the Gorbachev common home is a missed opportunity. However, something was achieved. European Community and the Soviet Union signed an agreement on trade and commercial and economic cooperation. In October, German unification was achieved with the community's first eastward enlargement. In November, the Charter of Paris for a new Europe was adopted, triggering the process towards the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. 1991, a dramatic year. On December, the Belovex Accord was signed and Soviet Union died. It's curious to notice that one day later, just the day after, European Council summit began in Maastricht, ending with the approval of the treaty. So Soviet Union died and European Union was born, just the day after. I conclude. So the last 2 years of the Soviet Union life saw the closing of Gorbachev's two-block apartment building and the opening of Delors village, if we wanted to use this image. Conclusion. I tried to find the historical significance of this failed attempt. At first, the common home was only a vague foreign policy tool that raised fears and concerns. Then the proposal took the more concrete form of a confederation between nation states and supranational institutions, with a different attitude between Gorbachev and Delors, and between Delors and Mitterrand. Lastly, during the revolutionary 2 years period from 1989 to 1991, the European Union was born, the Soviet Union died, and the debate surrounding a common European home came to an end. Through this debate, the conscience that Europe is a true community of people united by common cultural values and settled in the vast territory between the Atlantic and the Urals increased. So we could say Gorbachev was right in stressing we all are Europeans. We share common values. But it is a community that can neither live in one big house, a federation. This morning, someone said Gorbachev didn't want to join the European institution. He had an alternative view. So neither live in one big house, a federation. I think it's still an unrealistic and maybe a mistaken idea. Nor in several small houses, a confederation of many nation states. Today we are discussing about Macron relaunched the idea of confederation among nation states and European Union that now is stronger compared to the previous European community. It seems to me that it's a village. Europe, it's a village. So Delors was right in saying it's a village with a home. At the center of the village, there is a home named European Union, a potential confederation of federations, nation states, and supranational institutions. So this seems to be the historical significance of the debate sparked by Gorbachev's proposal to build a common European home, a cultural unity, a cultural community, people sharing common value in search of an appropriate institutional framework that cannot be neither one federation nor a weak confederations of many sovereign nation states. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antonio, for this, maybe a brilliant and very interesting presentation. You presented, you constructed the relationship between two leaders, two visionary leaders, two socialists, of course, with different background, Catholic one, Delors, and Marxist one, Gorbachev, and two reformists. You clearly explained that in the second half of the 80s, there were two reforms that were made in the European community and in the Soviet Union. Two leaders that spoke about the need to make economic reforms with politics in mind. Both Delors and Gorbachev were convinced that only the economic reform could give the possibility to maintain, to safeguard the role of great powers of the Soviet Union on one hand and the European community on the others. And of course, two ideas of Europe. And this is interesting. In my opinion, in this conference, this is my impression. The idea of the common European house that you defined a vague program, but in a sense, receive some dignity from what you said. After all, there was behind that vague proposal an idea of Europe. That was alternative, of course, to the Delors one, but it was, in a sense, rooted in the French tradition. It's obvious to think to what just de Gaulle said when we spoke about from the Atlantic to the Urals. So it was a new idea, but it was rooted also in the European tradition, in the French tradition. So in this sense, it was less vague than it can appear. Okay, but now I do not want, yeah, sure. Let me introduce Roberto Romani. Roberto Romani is a food professor at the University of Teramo. He's an economist. He's to say better, he's an historian of the economic thought. He dealt with the French, with the British, with the Italian economic thought, and in my opinion, this is particularly interesting to our aims. He also dealt with the relationship between Keynesianism and Marxism. And in this conference, he will present a paper on a matter of urgency, politics and time, the economics of Russian transition, 1990 to 2000. So the floor is.
Thank you, Simone. So this is the argument of my paper, which is quite theoretical. I mean, it's much more theoretical than the others I have attended this morning. We have attended this morning. So the argument consists of 4 propositions. The first proposition is that it may sound curious, but the economists' arguments for a shock therapy, for a big bang, were chiefly political rather than economic. The second proposition is that economists analyze the Russian politics through a synchronic framework. So no history involved. And this synchronic framework amounted to public choice theory, basically. And public choice theory focuses on self-interested individuals reacting to incentives. Incentives could shape institutions. Institutions could modify incentives. And I mean, it's obvious, but let me repeat this. There is a philosophical background to public choice theory, which is a mix of individualism, utilitarianism, and the materialism, of course. My third proposition is that on the basis of all this, the legacies of the Russian past became beyond the realm of economists' possible knowledge. Any historical legacy, according to my set of authors, could be overcome with proper incentives. Fourth proposition, to my mind, this kind of epistemological turn, this rejection of diachronic time, this was a major inadequacy because the transition either succeeded or failed in the various Eastern European countries, depending on the amount of social resources and human capital developed over a long period. This means, for instance, that the transition succeeded in Poland and Hungary, but failed in Russia. So let me list the political arguments put forward by economists to account for the shock therapy they recommended. First of all, my set of authors includes Lipton and Sachs, Dornbusch, Fischer, Schleifer, Aslund, and others. Most were Americans. Anyway, they were committed to neoclassical economics, okay? And their political arguments were actually 4. In the slide, you can see 3 main political arguments. Perhaps there were 4 arguments. And the first would be that a soft landing was impossible. I mean that, according to my authors, the social costs were to be high. The social costs of the economic transition were to be high, whatever the policy. So there was no free lunch, to use Milton Friedman's famous motto. Whatever the policy you like, whatever the policy you choose, there will be no soft landing as far as social costs are concerned. This is my first political argument. Again, it should be here. Okay. The second argument is the so-called window of opportunity. It's a well-known argument, and it goes like this. In the initial phase of transition, there is a large unanimity. There is some sort of enthusiasm among the population. There is agreement on what to do. And so this is the right time to push through reforms. According to the Minister of Finance in 1989, Balcerovitz, this would be a time of extraordinary politics. Again, a special time of history when governments can dare introduce radical reforms. Third argument, the logic of policymaking is synchronic, no time involved, meaning that each measure called for all others. Of course, this is a political argument because it involves policy making, which is a political process, but it's also economic because it rests on a certain idea of economics as an instantaneous, atemporal, time dimension science. And for instance, this means that the restructuring of firms required a working price system and also currency convertibility, etc. I mean, to be effective, economic reform had to be wide, complete, it must include a set of measures. Fourth, governments and bureaucracies were inefficient in the Eastern European countries and in particular in Russia. This is a problem if you want to pursue a gradualist economic policy, because gradualism requires a firm grip on the economy, a precise timetable for intervention, etc., etc. Again, you cannot rely on bureaucracy to implement complex multi-stage politics. It's too complicated for them. There is no personnel capable of mastering complex multi-stage policies. So it's better a shock therapy, a big bang. Again, this is why I think that my set of economists put forward arguments that were mostly political. I mean, there were also a set of economic arguments, but my interpretation is that the political was at the forefront, especially the window of opportunity argument, as you know. So now let me spend a few words on privatization, because I think that politics and the time shaped the debate on privatization first and foremost. This is a general statement, of course, but you can find it very, very clearly in this book, Privatizing Russia by Boychko, Schleifer, and Vizhny, which was published by MIT Press in 1995. This is an extraordinary book. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know other examples of memoirs like this, because Boychko, Schleifer, and Vizhny were all advisors to the Russian government, and they were telling their story, their activities. They were expounding the rationale behind their choice for a shock therapy, also as far as privatization was concerned. The fact is that at the time, most economists agreed that privatization in Eastern Europe was a daunting task because of political pressures coming from parliaments giving voice to lobbies of stakeholders. On the economic side, the crux of the matter was to privatize in a way leading to the restructuring of firms. Anyway, privatization, according to the mainstream, required plenty of time. For instance, according to Lipton and Sachs, 4 years were needed to privatize Poland's 500 largest state enterprise. Of course, when we talk about privatization, we talk about privatizing large enterprises, not the corner shop. Okay, Boyko, Schleifer, and Vizhny argued for the opposite. They argued for a big bang also in privatization policy. According to them, it was imperative to act quickly, basically for 2 reasons. The first was that if the privatizing program had not been pushed through fast, the opposition to any kind of privatization would have organized itself ever more effectively. So let's start soon, let's start now, before the lobbies can get stronger and stronger. Second, in a country like Russia, where economic transition had failed to materialize so far, nothing had had occurred before, privatization was expected to create a constituency for reform. It was expected to create approval for reform. And this, of course, would have enabled further progress. So again, Boyko, Schleifer, and Vizhny had a public role. They came from Harvard. 2 of them came from Harvard, one from the University of Chicago, and they recommended fast privatization against the views of most economists. And what they advised actually occurred. It was not a pipe dream. It became in 1992, as you know, when circa 15,000 public enterprises were privatized. Between 1992 and 1994. I'm talking about the voucher privatization, not the loans for shares privatization, which is a different business. So a corollary of this idea by Boyko, Schleifer, and Vizhny was that the creation of the institutions and the legislation of free market should not necessarily precede privatization, because people did not care about these institutions until, as property owners, they had an economic interest in them. This is quite absurd. This goes against the grain of common sense. And everybody knows how bad the outcome of the SWIFT, of the ultra-quick Russian privatization was. Let me add that the 3 writers, the 3 authors of this important, interesting book, were all involved in corruption trials, and the story in particular involving Schleifer is particularly serious, and it was and it still is a major stain on the reputation of Harvard. So they recommended something which went against the opinion of most economists, and they were corrupted. So it will be interesting to study if the two dimensions somehow overlapped. Meaning if their policy proposals were intended to favor their private interests. But I've not done this. So what's the gist of my paper? a deep reason for the bankruptcy of Russian advising lay in the handling of economics as a boundless, self-contained science. I'm referring to the so-called economics imperialism, which you certainly know from the study of Gary Becker and the Chicago School of Economics. The limitations of the economic approach to politics are quite clear to me. Even apart from the neglect of history, apart from the neglect of the huge legacy of history on the country, on Russia, just consider the neglect of the sociological and cultural structures, and also the dismissal of the possibility of unintended outcomes. To the economists I've considered, reality was made by interests. If people had an interest in something, okay, they would pursue their own self-interest, and this shaped history. This only shaped history, but it's not enough. And it's curious in my mind that the rationale of the Russian transition did not came from political scientists, did not came from historians. It came from economists. But economists have to do with wealth, with money. So something strange occurred at the epistemological level. Economists became total social scientists. They were ready to speak of everything. In fact, if you take, it's ironic, but if you take Lipton and Sachs, who were amongst the most brilliant economists of the time of this historical period, well, they also, not only politics, but also history was a field in which they wrote, on which they were wrote. And in my mind, the economist's choice of a Big Bang was less ideological, meaning less neoliberal, than this epistemological arrogance. Especially if you consider that gradualism too had its shortcomings. I mean, it's common to find that historians deplore, condemn the choice of a shock therapy in Eastern Europe. This is quite common. But even gradualism, even the alternative was not certain. At any rate, I mean, the choice between gradualism and the shock therapy is fine to me. I mean, do you go for the shock therapy? Okay. But don't, I mean, respect the boundaries of disciplines. Don't pretend to say something in a way which is too circumscribed, in a way which is limited. And so, I mean, the experiences of market socialism in Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the USSR under Gorbachev, I mean, were examples of the possible limitations of gradualism. So to me, again, the problem with the transitionology, as it was called, is not exactly the shock therapy, but the ambition, the arrogance of economists talking about everything. I mean, becoming a political scientist, becoming historians, etc., and anthropologists, because there was that famous debate on the Russian man, the Soviet man, and they had something to do. It's curious how much. Boychko, Schleifer, and Vizhny begin their book by saying there is nothing particular in the Russian man and woman. I mean, they are economic men like all others. There is no difference, and it's. I mean, it's ludicrous. They say we can argue for this hypothesis because there have been 2 telephone surveys of say a few hundred Russians, questioning them about what do you think about capitalism? What do you think about profit? Is socialism okay? What is better? I mean, on the basis of 2 telephones, polls, they were able to say there is nothing particular with the Russians. They have no particular legacy to overcome. They are economic men. Give them the right institutions, or give them the incentives, give them the hope to become rich, and they will become rich. Some of them succeeded, most failed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much to Roberto Romani and his analysis of a crucial point, the role that economists played in the shock therapy. Probably this topic should be investigated, should be further investigated to understand what was the role of Western economists, of Russian economists, and also the interactions between the two. And also, and this has much to do with the aims of our conference, what was the role of the European economist and the European community in itself. I remember that 5 years ago, I organized together with two colleagues of mine in the University of Padua a conference whose title was the Brussels Consensus. And I remember that in that conference, the idea that indeed the Washington Consensus, of course, was important, but Brussels was part of that Washington Consensus, was not an alternative. It did not represent an alternative to that consensus. So it's interesting to understand this role and to understand what was the role or the lack of role that the European community and that economists played in the shock therapy. Unfortunately, we were not able to involve Tatiana Zonova, but I'm an obstinate person, so I promise you that I'll try again, and I hope to be able to involve her tomorrow at the worst. But I think that we have material enough to make a discussion on the crucial topic of the economic dimension of the relations between the European Community, European Union, and the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation between the late 80s and the early 90s. So if there are questions, now the time has come to make them.
Hello. I was curious about this process of privatization about Russian public companies, because actually in Italy, in the same period, it happened like the privatization of public companies as well, in the mid 90s. So I would say if we can draw some parallels, maybe in the academic literature, like they were forcing as well or inducing the privatizations of the Italian public companies was like a general economic movement, or was just this is far-fetched, we cannot draw parallels.
Thank you. On the first presentation, I just wanted to suggest, it's just an observation, that perhaps even though this conference focuses on the relationship between Western Europe and the Soviet Union, some of the issues that you've been talking about, I think were already present before the collapse of the Soviet Union or before the prospect of East Central European countries making this transition quickly and possibly applying for membership at some point of the European communities. So Delors' attitude of deepening before widening was something that was first primarily directed against other West European countries that were interested in joining the European communities, namely Austria and then later on Finland and Sweden. The Austrians already discussing the membership application in 1986. So it's an earlier stage, and there the fear is, well, there are some countries that have an odd, in the case of Finland, semi-dependent on the Soviet Union relationship with the Soviet Union, or that are formally neutral like Sweden, or that are neutral in a different way based on the Swiss model according to domestic constitution in Austria. So there are all of these countries that are more easily, can be economically relatively easily integrated, but will create other kinds of problems for the deepening process potentially. So I think you already have in the institutions of the European communities a strong aversion to widening or enlargement that would take place too quickly and complicate this process of internal deepening, both in terms of economic and monetary union and in terms of some form of political union. And that is so, therefore, there's already a template in terms of attitudes, in a sense, that can then be applied to Eastern Europe as well, would be a suggestion that I'm making here to bring in this other intra-West European perspective. And on the second presentation, I just wanted to ask, I think you've brought out very well why these economists were, I think, as you put it, epistemologically arrogant. I have two questions about this. One is, why were they allowed to be so arrogant at the time when many of the same economists had only 5 or 10 years earlier had actually believed East European statistics and called the GDR the 10th largest industrial power in the world, for example. So they had already failed once in terms of their assessment. And so why were they allowed, if you think, sorry, taking statistics from East European countries at face value and assuming that therefore, for example, the GDR was the 10th largest industrial producer in the world, to give you just one example, when, of course, other social scientists had a much better insight into the actual functioning of the East European economy and the possible actual falsification of many of the statistical data that was coming out of the system. But secondly, was it because there were no alternative views? There were alternative views, as you've already suggested, in coming from other disciplines. Why was it that the domestic political choice was made in this Russia in transition to listen only to these economists and to employ the most radical version, if you like, of the kind of policy advice that these people were giving at the time? Because as you pointed out, broadly coming from a similar background, someone like Balcerowicz and the Polish government applied a broadly similar, but somewhat slower and perhaps more intelligent form of policy of economic liberalization that had arguably much better, significantly better long-term economic effects than those that were implemented in Russia.
Angelo Romano, and after, if you want, because I saw other two, and so we can, if you agree, we can make a first round of questions and a second round of questions. Is okay for you? Because there are at least 6 persons that in total that want to interview. So we can give Angelo Romano, and after that I will give you the floor, and we'll start from Elena, Alexander, and Olga. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Simone. I don't see you anymore. So I have a question for, well, maybe both, but probably more for Antonio Malliolo. So I was thinking in terms of the project, the idea, which is very vague, you said that very clearly, but the European common home. I wanted to ask you to go more, considering your expertise, into perhaps the economic components of it, if you had the possibility to see any specifics in that sense, because I agree with your reading that was an eminently foreign policy tool. But at the same time, there is a lot there about cooperation and economic cooperation and technological cooperation, and it's been there for decades, the Soviet policy towards Western Europe in general, in the community specifically. So I was wondering whether you saw specific economic features in this big idea of a European economic home. And the second, more general question is, would you agree that even if it appeared to be, because this is something that I'm also trying to figure out in my paper and in general, my views on the topic. Do you think that is the origins or the continuation, I would say, of opposing views about what to do with relations in the continent? Because I liked very much that you brought to the fore the two visions, and they seem to be going in the same direction, but at the same time they are completely different in how relations should be organized in the continent. And it seems to me that that continues to be the case in no matter what nice or less nice approach in the Kremlin. There is a contended area which is still today at the very heart of the conflict with Ukraine. So, do you have the impression that it's just an appearance of cooperation, of going together in the same direction, but really, even in the nicer periods of Gorbachev, it remains the fact that there are two major powers in the continent that are competing for being the hegemon on the continent?
Okay, you can answer that. That will.
Thank you very much. I completely agree with you, with Professor Kaiser, and with Angela. What I wanted to stress is just one key idea. In my view, and also this morning, several colleagues have stressed this point. Gorbachev's attitude was, first of all, to save socialism and to trigger a process of cooperation. In Gorbachev's writings, we can find one key word: interdependence. Interdependence among nation states. And to manage interdependence, they needed international cooperation. In Western Europe, the key word is integration. Integration. And in order to manage economic integration, we need supranational government. We need to lose national sovereignty. Now, I agree, it's an old story. And maybe the story began after the end of World War II, when everyone was pro-Europe. Everyone was pro-Europe, basically for one reason: to ensure peace, to prevent a new war. But the great debate was how to unify Europe: federalism, internationalism, and finally functionalism. David Mitrani and then other followers. If we look at the history of Europe, we can recognize three great stages. First, the building of a single or common or internal market for freedoms. Then the question was, can a single market work without a strong monetary union? And the answer was no. We need a stronger monetary union. Let me quote briefly Delors' report. A single currency would clearly demonstrate the irreversibility of the move to monetary union. So the idea was, we must go beyond a regime of fixed exchange rate, and Soros' speculation shows the weakness. Now, after the monetary union, after the Great Recession of 2008, a new challenge. We faced a new challenge. Can a monetary union work without a fiscal union, meaning a common fiscal policy, meaning European budgetary, meaning a stronger European democracy? Now, while Gorbachev was thinking about a model of cooperation among sovereign nation states, Delors and the European Commission were trying to complete the European home. So what I try to say is, according to Delors, the priority was to complete the Europe home, achieving a strong model of political union. And it's different from Gorbachev's perspective. And today we are in face of the same problem. Macron's confederation, it's the same problem. And we know that it's very difficult to finish the process of European integration. So, Angela, in my view, this is the issue. Without economics, we cannot understand the political process of European integration, because the problem is, can a market work without a monetary union? Can a monetary union work without fiscal union? Can we achieve fiscal union without a stronger European democracy?
Yes. So about privatization in Italy and Russia, I mean, the example of the United Kingdom was often brought to stress the differences, however, because, as you know, Margaret Thatcher privatized a few major companies, but the case of Italy or the UK, privatization in Italy or the UK regarded a few dozens big companies. In Russia, we had hundreds of thousands of big and small companies. Nothing was private in Russia, as you know, apart from agriculture, but even the shops were public property. So it was a huge task, and and this is a major reason accounting for the differences between Western Europe's privatizations and Russia's privatization. But in Russia, as you know, there was also a political aspect to consider. I mean, especially at the beginning, privatization was thought as a policy with populist implications. It was possible to give people something, because the public property was the workers' property, the manager's property, the man in the street's property. So it was necessary to give each of these figures something. And this was the intention of the vouchers privatization. And and of course, this political populist, they said, this political side of the matter was not considered and was not present in Western Europe. How it ended, well, you know that very well. Chubais, I don't know how to pronounce this name, Chubais, who was the big boss of the privatization agency, became the most hated man in the country. But over the first few months, the operation worked. The voucher idea, which was not only Russian, but it also was attempted in Czechoslovakia, in the Czech Republic. I mean, the idea, it was a good idea, and it was perceived as such by the people who went to the bank to get their own vouchers. It seemed as if something good could come from privatization. But over time, people understood that it was only a matter for insiders, especially the managers, as you know. So this is the two differences I can identify right now between the Western experience and the Russian experience. As far as your question is concerned, so basically, why those crazy economists were given so much power? They were allowed to advise governments. It's a very, very big question. Let me point to three views. The first is that economists were important because the economic problem was momentous. I mean, the political transition could be solved with a quick change of political institutions. Of course, we know that democracy is not just a parliament, but habits and balance of powers, etc. But anyway, there were clear recipes around. You could go for a presidential model, you could go for an Italian model, for a party democracy, whatever. But it was just, at least at the beginning, a matter of changing the institutions. Okay, the economic problem was scaring from the very beginning. What do we do with thousands of huge factories which are inefficient, which do not compete, which are unable to compete, where salaries were not paid, or where salaries were not related to performance, where no kind of hard budget was present. This issue of the hard budget is central in the literature. I try to express myself as best as I can. In a Western enterprise, managers have to respect certain have to respect the budget. They can't rely on an external source paying you money when you make the wrong deal. There is no way out. Instead, economists stressed the necessity of a hard budget constraint because the state in Russia and elsewhere in Eastern Europe was in the habit of giving money, credits, basically for free, just to turn the red into black. So managers were managers not the Western way. They were some sort of fathers. They also, as you know, had the social service part of the society under their command. But this is not the point. The point is that the economic problem was momentous. Nobody knew really how to tackle it. And suddenly, out of nowhere, a set of economists arrived and said, hey, we have the recipe. We have the recipe. It's a big bang. It's quick. It's painful. But after a while, you'll reap the rewards. This is the idea. So the first reason why economists were so important, to my mind, is that the economy was important. The second reason has to do with the epistemological dimension of the issue. As you know, economics is regarded by its practitioners as a hard science. So there is no relationship between sociology, history, anthropology, and economics. Economics belongs to the hard sciences. It's a bit like physics. It's a bit like biology. Maybe we can criticize that view, but this is the view that works. Economists after 1945 were able to present themselves as hard scientists, as dealing with quantitative data, and they earn the respect that comes out very clearly when a problem so urgent and so demanding is brought. So economics as a hard science, whereas historians are divided among themselves. They say strange things. They talk to themselves. They are unable to find a common voice and to address the public, the wide public. The third reason for the importance of economics and economists is, of course, the intellectual scenario on a global scale, because, you know, globalization is a historical process, but it was also an ideology. And that was the time of the end of history. And Fukuyama writes in the Public Interest, politics is settled. Politics is settled. There is nothing to invent. We don't have to invent the wheel. There is just the economy. And this speaks volumes, in my view, about an intellectual scenario where economics was called to play a major role.
Elena.
Yes, only two considerations. The first one is that I would be more careful to define Gorbachev a socialist because he wasn't. He was a real, poor, genuine Bolshevik. And this is the reason for that he failed, because he had the opportunity to save the Soviet economy when because in Soviet Union existed a black market, a black economy, and there was a very big discussion, reflection about how to manage this black economy, and the choice was to eradicate this black economy. And this was a big mistake because Gorbachev wanted the law about the abolition of, I don't know in English, i redditi non guadagnati, la legge sui redditi non guadagnati. Mm-hmm. He destroyed gardens, because small private shops existed in the town, but he decided to refuse any kind of model of NEP because they discussed about it. We could use the old model of NEP, the new political economy. And Gorbachev, because he was a real pure Bolshevik, didn't like it. So the choice was very clear, and the choice was was coherent with his ideological point of view. It was said that economists were arrogant. Maybe they were ignorance. We have to take into consideration that Chubais, Chernomordin were people who for a long, long time worked in the ministries of Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union became the country of lie. Everybody mentivano, come si dice? Lied in Soviet Union. The statistics were completely wrong because every minister, every functionary preferred to write something wrong, a number wrong, instead of admit that the plan failed. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, the economists didn't know anything about a real market. This was the problem. And it was said that the voucher in Russia had success, but this is not true. It was a horrendous mistake, and because yes, the voucher were published in theory were for all the people because Soviet patrimony was public patrimony, but really they were not published. So only members of former nomenclatura from former ministry had the opportunity to buy this voucher at a very low cost. Yes. Yes, but the majority of this share of vouchers were bought by former member of nomenclatura, of ministries, of manager of old enterprises. So they bought them at a very low price, and after they become the oligarch. this is the way how the oligarchs were born. Thank you.
Alexander and Olga.
Can I add just one thing? I thank you, and I agree. I used the word socialist just in a very broad sense, and I was thinking about the debate on the two blocks, because President Bush said there cannot be a common European home until all within it are free to move from room to room. So basically the idea was, is Gorbachev ready to guarantee the four freedoms, meaning to adopt a capitalist model? And basically Gorbachev tried to say, no, we can have a common home between the two blocks, socialist countries and capitalist countries. So, but you are a master in this topic, and I mean just in a very broad sense, socialism. I know that there are several meanings.
Alexander?
A question for Professor Romani. Before the collapse of the Soviet Union, during the perestroika years, there was an influence of these neoclassic, neoliberal Western economists on the economists closer to Gorbachev, like Leonid Abalkin or Abel Agambejan, or this influence there was only on the economists closer to Yeltsin, like Grigory Yavlinsky?
Olga?
I have two questions. The first one to Professor Malliulo. I would invite you to think about Gorbachev's policy in a broader sense. So when he became the prime secretary of the party, I read a lot memoir, some researches about his foreign policy, and the common idea is that he hadn't any idea about what foreign policy was. Okay, so he was in Russian it's хозяйственник. So he was somebody who was specialized in agriculture. So we know about his background, but he didn't know anything about foreign policy. The question is, how do you think? What was this idea about common European home? How it was realistic, and how it was really deeply thought about Gorbachev and his team. And in terms of, in fact, how realistic it was, I'm occupied by space, international relations in space, and I discovered about his idea. He said he proposed in different stages. He proposed in United Nations to the idea about creation the space in International Space Organization. And now, when I when I speak with his with testimonies with his with people who worked with him, and I asked, "Do you know about this organization? What do you think about it? Was Gorbachev convinced?" And International Space Organization, what it is. So nobody between even Russian former Soviet collaborators, Gorbachev's collaborators, didn't know what it was. So my question is, was it for just for propagandistic purposes? And I'm speaking not only about my space organization, but even about common European home. So how serious it was, this idea about the creation. And the question to Roberto Romani, I'm not economist, I'm historian, and I would say I'm victim of this shock therapy, because I lived in 90s, but I live like I was 10 years old, so I remember very well this voucher privatization, voucher reform, etc. How we lived in my family these events. But as historian, I'm asking, what would you do in 91? So you haven't a Russian former Soviet specialist of market economy. You have only people who, yes, they learned something, they know what it is market economy, etc., on the experience of European countries, America, and I'm speaking about different institutions that were founded in Soviet Union and were learning how it worked in West. We didn't speak about Gaidar, another hero of this period is Gaidar, Igor Gaidar, Chubais. They were young. They were young people without experience, with some knowledges. But people, for example, that you mentioned, this old, I don't know, old team of Soviet economists. Even they were just theorists. They were practical. And then we have, on the other hand, we have Americans, arrogant as you want, with very big wish to do something to realize their ideas. So what would you do in 91? Yes. Or Yeltsin. So what would, according to you, what would be the most wise choice on the place of Yeltsin?
If I really answered your question, I would be as arrogant as Gaidar and Chubais and Lipton and Sachs. Okay, you start answering.
No,
let me think.
Wait a moment, just conclude the round. Okay, Olga.
A small consideration. I'm not agree with Gorbachev, because he completely neglects that Russia has a complete different history from Europe. So religion is not common. We had great schism in the 11th century. In Russia, there was no Renaissance, there was no Enlightenment. It was completely different, as we know. We had some episodes, but as we know, there was no common Renaissance and there was no common Enlightenment. As in Europe, there was no liberalism, there was no bourgeois revolution. Russia was totally different. And regarding the 90s, I would suggest that the economists should have done social consideration, because in Russia, the individualism does not work. So it's a tradition, it's a millenaristic tradition. So in Siberia, which is not Moscow, which is not St. Petersburg, which is not Kazan, the main biggest city, there is a phrase that says "Krugovaya paruka," so collective responsibility. Everyone does a lot for the other one, and so I think that there should have been done this consideration even in the 90s, because the people that adopted the voucher and so on, as Professor Dundus said, they were not in knowledge of this system. They were not aware maybe of this system. And I think that the failure, because I studied it, I did my master thesis on the 90s and the Arctic policy of Vladimir Putin. So the 90s were a tragedy in Russia. I spoke with a lot of people, and the former interview said about it. It was a tragedy, and I think it was not only an economical and econometric question. It was even a social question, because there was a total misunderstanding of what Russian context was.
Other questions? Okay, because there are a few questions, I will add mine, and we concluded this round of questions, and more generally, I think questions for you. There is one page in the masterpiece of Donald Sassoon, 100 Years of Socialism, the European Left in the 20th Century, in which Donald Sassoon asked to himself, what is the reason why the European Union was not able to provide a model for the Soviet, for the post-Soviet Union? What was the reason why European socialism was not able to provide a model? And Donald Sassoon gave this answer, and I'm very curious to know what is your opinion about the answer that he gave. The answer is that, in many senses, European socialism had already died. In a sense, socialism and Keynesianism and the death of socialism and Keynesianism came before the death of Bolshevism and communism. When in the 80s, or to say better, in the early 90s, communism came to an end and the Soviet Union came to an end, socialism was not able to provide a model alternative to capitalism. Because at the moment in time, all the most important socialist parties, so the most important socialist leaders, spoke the language of competition, of free market. We saw the case of Delors, that was, as you said, the president of the European Commission, that was the president of the committee that made the proposal for the Economic and Monetary Union, but it was also the finance minister in the French government, and he was the finance minister that completely changed the economic policy of France. Do you agree with this idea? Do you agree with the idea that European socialism was not able to provide the model? So, of course, opening paving the way or given free action to neoliberalism, because indeed socialism had already died out.
Big questions. So the first one is Russia part or no of Europe? It's a controversial issue. We know that there are two great streams, Slavic and Western attitude. I appreciate a book published in 1950 by Polish historians Oskar Kaleski, who stressed similarities and differences, but basically he said Europe is the result of a huge dialogue among West and East, and Christianity, the Orthodox Church, played a key role. So I just said, according to Gorbachev, we all are Europeans. So we know that maybe it was just rhetorics, I don't know, but maybe today Putin would say, no, we are not at all European. So yeah, but I agree with you. It's a controversial issue. But Gorbachev said we all are European. A few days ago, a book was published entitled Russia and Western Economics. So it's an ongoing debate regarding the relationships between Russia and Europe. Yes or no? I mean, I believe that the institutional factor played a major role, because if you think about Maastricht, if you think about the 5 criteria to select pure Western countries to join the Economic and Monetary Union, if you think Ukraine today, again, the criteria, if you think about the reform of the Stability and Growth Pact today regarding Italy, so the problem was, okay, we can build a new European home, and the rules and the previous rules. So in my view, the idea was first to complete the European Federation, and then to build a confederation with Russia and with the other socialist countries. Olga, I missed the second part of your question, but the first one, I agree with you. He was an expert in agriculture, but reading his own writings, I think he was well aware that without a change in foreign policy, Russia would not able to trigger a radical reform. So foreign policy was a tool to gain resources, financial resources, to trigger a process of economic reform within the country.
Thanks for the questions. The first one was about the possible influence of Western economists during perestroika, right? And as far as I know, I will say that there was no influence of Western economists on the upper circles of the government. As you said, there were Russian economists who were proposing plans, the 500 days plan, for instance, and but according to many historians, as you know, those plans were confused, were defective, were poor, made little sense. Anyway, Gorbachev was, as everybody knows, uncertain about what to do in the economic terrain. And this went with a total collapse of ideology. Socialism was hated, and so there was nothing good in socialism. And this is a factor which is often overlooked by historians. I mean, how much just the simple word socialism, communists, were hated by the people who didn't want anything about that. Really, they were looking for something new, and what was easy to find a new model, not the European model of capitalism, but the American way of capitalism. And this is curious because if economics is really all-encompassing, if economics is really a total science, so it's not only a science of means, but it's also a science of ends. Economists picked the end of the transition, of political and economic transition, which was the American model of capitalism, which is, as you know, is quite different from the German, French, or even Italian welfare state idea. Okay. But I'm not an expert in the field. So as far as the other questions are concerned, I have really little to say. It's clear to me, it's clear to everybody that the transition occurred at the wrong time in history. And it was so also because socialism surrendered to neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a difficult word to handle, but it's useful. I'm thinking of the book by Philippe Thaer, 1989, published, translated by Princeton a few years ago, and which revolves around the spread of neoliberal policies in Eastern Europe. But, you know, over the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, the Social Democrats were giving up any kind of opposition idea and were endorsing neoliberalism. Just think of Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, of course, if I'm not mistaken, Schroeder in Germany, but in Italy we have Renzi, which is a sort of caricature if compared to those I've just mentioned. And then to try to answer your question, it's obvious that you can't oppress a people for 70 years without giving rise to apathy, indifference, skepticism, egoism. I mean, this happens. This happened in southern Italy, for instance, to my mind, and so the people, you know, become like the rulers. At the beginning of this century, I published a book on the intellectual history of national character in Britain and France. And I remember that in the 18th century, several philosophers pointed to the example of rulers as something which affected the way of thinking and the way of behaving of people. And I suppose, I mean, I'm no expert, so I'm really as if we were over dinner. If we were over dinner, I would say perhaps 70 years of legal killing, legal theft from the rulers, I mean, affected civil society in Russia. And this is why plans didn't work, because they did not impact on the right human material. But again, I'm an intellectual historian, so I focus on ideology, I focus on examples, so I understand that it's pretty superficial. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that you enjoyed this first day of works. So now we are have concluded. So just some practical information indeed, because as you know, tomorrow morning we'll start again at 9. And tomorrow morning we have other 2 sessions. The first one will be, as I told you and as you know, about technological and military aspects, and we conclude with the analysis of the Italian case. Now we have around 2 hours and a half at your disposal, so we'll meet or directly the restaurant that you already know and that I repeat. The name is Osteria I Santi in Via Santa Maria 71. For the people that are at the hotel, we'll meet, if you want, at 8 and we'll go there together. And as Roberto said, we'll continue our discussions, or we speak about other and softer topics. Okay, so thank you.